Hello, my name is Arney. I'm a political science major, and I am here presenting on my research project on U.S. foreign aid to Jordan. I would like to thank my advisor, Jane Cramer, for making this project possible, and everyone at the Center for Undergraduate Research Excellence for giving me the first year research experience grant to actually go to Jordan and do some of this research. So U.S. foreign aid is interesting to me because it's oftentimes seen in very black and white terms. People think we should be giving more money to help other countries, or we shouldn't because we should be helping ourselves. But there's some people, and I generally found myself in this camp broadly on aid, is that aid can actually be harmful for its own sake. Aid can actually do more harm than good. So I decided to actually investigate that in a particular case, which is Jordan. Because Jordan is one of the largest recipients of U.S. Foreign aid. We'll get into that. So I want to start with this, which is a picture I took while I was there. This is a garbage can in the middle of Wadi Rum, and someone has, this is not the most coherent graffiti, but it looks like they're saying no UNDP, no GEF. The UNDP is the UN Development Program, and the GEF is the Global Environmental Facility, both of which are large aid organizations, give a lot of money to Jordan. And, someone evidently didn't like them enough to, write this little inscription, which I took a picture of. And this is a quote from a former, now Jordanian parliament member who was expelled after saying this as part of a speech. That he thinks aid in Jordan is often used for corrupt purposes. And so we'll get into what that means later and how true that actually is. So first, general numbers. This is aid to Jordan. This is all aid. This source of this is foreignassistance.gov, which is USAID's, the U.S. Agency for International Development, is their resource for data of how much money is going to countries, and it's broken down. It's been a super helpful resource in my work. But this is just constant in current dollars. Constant just means adjusted for inflation. So as you can see, aid sort of starts fairly low in 1951 and then builds up to this point where it is now. It was over $2 billion in 2020. We see this drop off at the end because we don't have the full numbers for 2022 yet, and also because there was a lot of extra aid given to Jordan during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's another spike here in 2003. You'll never guess what happened. It was the Iraq War. We'll get into that later. This is just cash transfers to Jordan. Aid is more than just cash transfers. But you can see, in 2022, $845 million was obligated. In total, it is now over $1 billion. With the most recent memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2022. So here's some broad stuff about aid in general. It's not actually obvious that aid really benefits the recipient. There's been a lot of work that says that it's negatively correlated with democracy, that it's not really correlated at all with economic growth. There's some work that said the aid can succeed in what's called a good policy environment by Burnside and Dollar. But there's been a lot of work that disputes this. There was the book that really got me into aid was Dead Aid by Navid Samoyo, which is the source I have at the bottom. It's mostly focused on Africa, but Jordan is obviously not in Africa, but it's still one of the largest recipients of aid. So let's move on to some more stuff about Jordan in particular. So here's a map of the Middle East. As you can see, there's Jordan. It's right next to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Israel and Palestine. And this over here is a map of, it's basically essentially a heat map of how much aid the U.S. gives to certain countries. As you can see, the lighter blue, the less aid you get. And obviously countries like Iran, we don't really give aid to at all. And as you can see, there's some light blue, there's some darker blue in these countries like Egypt, Sudan, and then there's Jordan and there's Israel. And Jordan, almost all of the aid that the U.S. gives to Israel is military aid. That's not the case in Jordan. In Jordan, actually, most of it is non-military, which is Jordan is actually the largest recipient of non-military aid from the U.S. And that's what this project is mainly focused on. I looked at a bit at military aid, but not necessarily on its effects on the security position of Jordan, although that is an important part of U.S. aid policy. But yeah, the only countries that are above Jordan in terms of overall aid received is Israel and I think Afghanistan. But in recent years, obviously, the U.S. has not been giving as much aid to Afghanistan as it has for the last 20. So here's some more stuff about Jordan. It plays an important spot in the Middle East because of its location and because of its political relationships with places like Israel and Palestine. Jordan has been a key player in the Palestinian peace process for as long as it has existed, and it still does today. Jordan has pretty good relationships with Saudi Arabia. I put an asterisk there because of the 2017 Qatar diplomatic crisis, which we'll talk about a bit later. Jordan offered support to the U.S. during both Iraq wars, as we saw earlier. They did have to be paid handsomely for it. That wasn't necessarily. I should be a bit more clear about what this spike means. This was aid given in terms of, it was called emergency economic funding, but it was part of it was negotiated with was for Jordan to essentially covertly support the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and they got a lot of emergency funds to help manage the Iraqi refugee crisis. The war was not necessarily popular in Jordan. Something I noticed there was a lot of people actually had Saddam Hussein bumper stickers. Just something that I noticed while I was there. But Jordan did covertly support the U.S. war in Iraq. So going back to, this is what actual U.S. aid looks like today. So this is, I put it into three main categories, which is project-based development, which is stuff like building hospitals or creating a teacher training program. Those are like what project-based means. Budget support, which is essentially transferring money to the Jordanian government, either in general or for a specific purpose, like to build this water pipeline. And then there's military aid, which is like obviously money given to the military for training or purchasing equipment. And so I have the aid broken down by funding agency and by managing agency. The funding agency is like who supplies the money, which is oftentimes not as important as who actually manages it. So the managing agency, basically stuff that's managed by the DoD, Department of Defense, is mostly military aid. Stuff that's managed by USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, is mostly the project-based development stuff. A lot of it is also budget support, but this budget support tends to be like for particular projects. And the most of the aid that's managed by the State Department is like direct cash transfers to the government for whatever purpose they want. Which is sometimes one of the most heavily criticized forms of aid, is when you just give money to a country's government without having it be for any particular reason. Because of, as we talked about earlier, corruption, which is a thing that happens in Jordan, not necessarily in the way that happens in a lot of other places. In some places, the big example of this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the president literally just stole like millions of dollars, put them into his own account, and used them to pay for a luxurious wedding for his daughter. In Jordan, that doesn't really happen. What more happens is that the Jordanian government is essentially, it hires based on not quite patronage systems, but it essentially hires people that the government likes. You can get a good government job if you know people. People aren't necessarily selected on the basis of merit. And cash transfers to the government essentially end up going to those people, and there's no conditionality on it. We're not saying that you should reform your systems for hiring for government positions, and thus that's basically the kind of corruption that happens. So yeah, moving on, like this is some stuff about USAID in particular. It's primarily a funding agency, and as we saw, like it manages most of the aid, but it gives money to people, mostly to American companies, which are known sort of derogatorily as the Beltway Bandits, because they reside on the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and they take all the government contracts for themselves. The reason why is because they're oftentimes really good at doing this stuff. So it's not necessarily always seen as a bad thing in the development world that these companies are doing stuff, but it does mean that Jordanians oftentimes aren't getting to work on it as much as Americans are, which can be not necessarily a bad thing, but not a good thing, right? And then it also comes in terms of prioritization. We're not necessarily prioritizing what Jordan actually wants. We're doing what we want. But this is actually, the U.S. is actually moving away from this policy, and all of USAID is broadly, not just in Jordan, but broadly USAID is taking more of a position of we should be doing more of what local governments want, because they know the situation better than us. And we can actually serve our goals better by prioritizing their goals, which historically has been like a trend in what the U.S. has tried to do in Jordan. Is essentially it's in our interest for what the Jordanian government wants to happen, but only certain things. We'll get into that a bit later. So what like problems actually exist in Jordan to solve with aid? Stuff like water security. Jordan is one of the most water poor countries in the world. Unemployment rate, which is especially high among women and youth, only about 13% of women are actually employed in Jordan, which is a very, very low employment rate, one of the lowest in the world, which is highly detrimental to the economy because a good portion of half your workforce is just not working because of primarily cultural pressure. And then high public debt and low tax revenue. Jordan's debt is right now is in 2022 was 108% of GDP, which means Jordan literally owes more money to people than there exists money in Jordan. And low tax revenue, which is not only low, but lower than the Jordanian government estimates that it will be. Access to quality healthcare. There actually is a fairly high quality healthcare system in Jordan. It's just not accessible to everyone because people aren't covered in the right places. And there's also lots of data collection problems in Jordan, which USAID has tried to solve. Educational attainment is the big number that I remember is that Jordanian kids are in school for an average 11.6 years, and they get about 7.6 years worth of education out of that. Excuse me. So that's obviously a big challenge. And a lot of the teachers there are oftentimes not qualified to be teachers. They're just professionals that end up teaching, or they just like have a degree in engineering, now they're teaching science. Barriers for the private sector. It's very hard to get a business started in Jordan. It has been because of systems aren't modernized, and there are taxes on businesses that end up subsidizing the wealthy through electricity. So now, like, is aid actually solving these problems? Somewhat. In terms of water development projects haven't really gone very far. That's not necessarily due to aid killing them, but it's just because cooperation is very hard. Working with countries like Israel, Palestine, the United Arab Emirates, it's not easy to do. Certainly not a success story of aid. I don't know if I'd call it an absolute failure, though. Unemployment is not necessarily going down. Aid might actually be contributing to causing it to go down, but there are other forces that aid is not strong enough to get over. Debt is still increasing, despite U.S. efforts to improve the tax system. Education projects actually are doing well. It's probably one of the biggest success stories of aid in Jordan is education. You can see those numbers on screen: 5% increase in reading comprehension based on USAID assessment, and then 15,083 teachers that were trained by the USAID under a new program that they had started. Jordan also jumped 29 places in the World Bank's Doing Business report, which is essentially a report on how easy it is to do business in a country. In a country. I said that right. Jordan's actually, it's getting easier to do business there, which is a good thing. And then we also saw the creation of the Maternal Mortality Surveillance and Response System, which is one of the most up-to-date systems in the middle-income world for tackling maternal mortality. That was heavily subsidized by the U.S. So now we get into the deeper part. Is aid actually meant to solve these problems? And I would say largely not really, at least not as a primary goal, although it has been sort of moving that way. The aid historically has been very much political. We want stability in Jordan, and to do that, we are going to help the government essentially look good to its citizens so that there's not instability, which means the government can act essentially how it wants, and that it maintains friendly relations with the U.S. That's been largely the goal of policy, which has been not necessarily like a bad thing. Like if you're doing things that make the population hate the government less, that means probably the citizens are more satisfied, which is probably a good thing. There are you can find lots of quotes of U.S. officials saying, yes, we are investing in this project so that we look good on broader issues in the Middle East. So that's what the diplomatic point is. This political mission of aid, and combined with like the influence of USAID in particular as a major donor, has actually led to the U.S. misunderstanding Jordanian economic planning because it's not focused on that as much, because that's not the goal, is to do that. It's to do what the U.S. wants to be done, which has negatively impacted policy. And the last point, Israel, is it's something that I found in a lot of places, but not in a ton of particular depth. So that's one of the things I want to continue looking at as I continue this project, is Israel's relation as a neighbor of Jordan. How are they influencing U.S. aid policy? Unintended consequence of aid. I'm going to go over this pretty quick because this is already running pretty long. These common economic indicators are high. Dutch disease, which is when your country's domestic currency gets overvalued relative to an external one like the US dollar, it seems to be present, but not necessarily tied as much to aid as it is to remittances, because the Jordanian dinar is pegged to the US dollar. So we wouldn't expect Dutch disease as much. Inflation is not very high. It was 4.23% in 2022, which is kind of high, but it's overall that's an outlier. It usually is much lower than that. And there's not really much of an association with aid there. In terms of foreign policy, refugee rentierism is basically there's research that shows that because Jordan accepted a lot of Syrian refugees, it got a lot of aid money from that, and thus it basically tried to inflate the number of refugees inside Jordan and encourage refugees to come to Jordan because it used that aid money as a development tool, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but in terms of aid affecting foreign policy, it's a thing that happened. The 2017 Qatar crisis, I think we talked about this a bit, but basically Saudi Arabia wanted to condemn Qatar for allegedly funding Iranian-backed militias, and Jordan at first didn't go along with that because Saudi Arabia had recently cut their aid. So it's what we call this is rent-seeking, which is basically acting in a way that encourages other states to give you aid rather than investing in developing your own domestic economy, which is what Jordan has sometimes done. These are examples of that. I want to continue looking into more examples of that as I continue this research. Changes in trajectory. I'm just going to skip over this a bit. We sort of talked about most of this. More inclusion of women and youth. We didn't really talk about that. Yeah, we saw, going back, we saw like these development priorities of USAID. I think I sort of skipped over these also. But this is what they call cross-cutting objective, which is the inclusion of women and youth in all of these development objectives. You just have to read them all for yourself, but I want to get through everything in time. More focus in the private sector. We sort of talked about that. Localization, we talked about that. The current memorandum of understanding is not conditional. Yeah, so it's the U.S. is moving away from conditionality, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. There are positive and negative impacts of that. Here are some sources that I cited in the slide. I use a lot more in my actual research. And then these are just some pictures that I took while I was there. So thank you all for watching this, and thank you again to the Center for Undergraduate Research Excellence at the University of Oregon for funding this research project. I hope to continue working on it. Hopefully there's a paper in the works. That is all for today. Thank you.